Hi, I'm Nancy Scott of Masterpiece Quilting. Welcome to Annie's Creative Studio and this Learn How to Quilt with Charm Packs episode. If you haven't already done so, we want to make sure that you download the Charms Plus pattern that is part of your download. This was designed by Bev Getchaw. She is a talented designer who always takes really simple blocks and provides a really magical twist in their layout. Let's go ahead and get started making this quilt. We've got just one block that we're making today, but we're going to make it in a lot of fun different colors. And then we're going to add a twist to the layout. May look a little complex when you first look at the assembly diagram, but it goes together really easily once you kind of see how things go. And I'm here to coach you through that and take you step by step so that you can achieve the same beautiful looking quilt that Bev did in the Charms Plus. Let's go ahead and get started by talking about our materials list. Because after all, that's where we start when we're quilting, is with our materials list, whether we're pulling items from our stash or whether we're at a fabric store or we're getting ready to head to the fabric store. This particular quilt uses 5-inch pre-cuts, and just about every fabric company has a 5-inch pre-cut. The challenge is they all call them by a different name. Lots of times they'll be have some sort of a 5-inch name. Anyway, I'm using Island Batiks for this project that I'm working on today, and Island Batik calls theirs Island Stamps. Don't ask me why, but anyway, all of them have a different name, but we're all talking about the same creature here, these little 5-inch pre-cuts. The key to this particular pattern is we want matching pairs of 5-inch pre-cuts. And I'm bringing this to your attention just so you can be a savvy shopper. When you're looking at this, it talks about the fact that this little stamp set has 42 pieces with 21 different fabric designs. That means there's going to be 2 of each fabric design, and that's what we want. So as I flip through here, we have 2 of this really pretty orangey yellow, 2 pieces of purple, there we go, 2 purples, another print, back to another orangey red. You get the idea. We want to have 2 of each. If the particular pre-cuts package that you purchase or are looking at doesn't have 2 of each, then make sure you're buying a second one. And just like they all come with different names, they all come with a different quantity in them. So be the savvy shopper. I've kind of given you that heads up on what to look for, but you want to make sure that you end up with a total of 32 matching pairs. So that's going to be 64 total. And then an additional 8 that we're going to need, and those don't have to pair up. They can just be any random pre-cut that you want. And moving down the materials list, we need a black print that is going to be for the binding. And then in the materials list, Bev used a cream solid. In this particular one, I'm going a little deeper and a little richer with my fabric for the background, and I'm actually using this kind of a caramel colored batik from Island Batik. So that's what I'm working with as I work through and make this project here with you today. The cutting instructions are really pretty straightforward, but just a few things I wanted to highlight for you. With our matching pairs that I have right here, I've went ahead and broken open a package of pre-cuts. We've got 2 of them. I'm just going to leave them paired together when I cut. And we are cutting them into 2.5 by 5-inch rectangles. So basically just splitting them in half. So let me flip my cutting grid around here so I've got my 2.5 set up, and we're just going to cut right there. And now we have 4A rectangles that are matching from our 2 pre-cuts. and I just kind of stack them all together. We're going to be working with them together, so there's no reason to blend them together. Just keep them in a stack. If you quilt like I do, sometimes I have plenty of time that I can go ahead and cut fabric, or sometimes you just, that's what you're in the mood to do, is just cut up fabric. And I tend to kind of pre-kit myself projects, so that way if I'm going to a sew-in, I'm going to a retreat, or I just want to be able to sew and not really have to think a whole lot and stop and go cut items, I'll have things pre-cut. And one of the tips that I do is I'll just put everything into a little baggie, label them, that way I don't have to think about what did I cut later. So these are our A pieces. I've got just a scrap piece of paper with an A on it, and we'll have these all tucked into a bag, and then that way I know that I have all of them cut and that they are ready to sew, which is a huge time saver. Particularly if you're sewing at somebody else's house, or you just want to focus on your sewing and not having to go back and cut. So we've got our A rectangles. The other pre-cuts that we're going to be working with, we're just cutting them into 2.5-inch squares. So 2 cuts on that, 5-inch. So I made the first cut, cutting it in half. We'll just rotate our fabrics, and actually you can layer them. And then cut again to come up with our 4 2.5-inch squares. From the black print, as I mentioned earlier, we're doing our binding strips. On our cream solid, which in my case I'm using the caramel batik, we've got a couple of cuts. Pretty much everything is really straightforward. We're cutting strips, we're cutting rectangles, but we are doing some triangular cutting, and I want to show you that in case you are not familiar with cutting on the diagonal, and a little bit of caution about when you are cutting on the diagonal. We are cutting our end squares, and I have my first one already pre-cut here, subcut into a 7.25 inch. And on this particular one, the instructions ask us to cut it in half on one diagonal to make 2 triangles. So we've got our square, and this is our diagonal. So we will line up here. And I'm going to make my cut. Now I have 2 triangles. What happened when I made that cut? Because we started out with a square, we have both sides are on the straight of grain, but this center is now on the bias. And I'm going to go ahead and over exaggerate this just so you can see. You can see the stretch that I'm getting out of this. And when I let go, what do you notice? That stretch stays. So when you're cutting these triangles like this on the diagonal, and even as I lay them back down here, you can really see how I stretched and distorted that triangle. Make sure you handle these carefully that are cut on the diagonal. Many times right before I cut these squares, I like to press them, and I'll even use some type of a starch or starch alternative spray just to give them a little bit more body and to help keep that from stretching out like I did with this one. So that is our cutting on one diagonal. Now we have our M squares. And the instructions ask us to cut this on both diagonals. And we're looking at this, and if you don't have a huge cutting mat, you're thinking, this could be a little challenging. We're going to be cutting this diagonal and we're going to be cutting that diagonal. A little bit of a tip for you. If you're working on a smaller surface, not everybody has a huge cutting mat. What we can do is, because we want to make our cut going this way, I'm going to actually fold this in half on the diagonal and line it up, bring it across, and using the lines on my cutting mat, make sure that I have this straight. I'm straight up there. Confirming this with my cutting grid. And now I'm going to cut both layers at the same time. And now if we open it up, we have just cut our triangle or our square in half on one diagonal to make two triangles. But we need to cut it on the other diagonal also, so we end up with 4 triangles. So I'm going to fold in half this way. So now I am layering the two and making sure that I'm lined up. And as you remember before, this is now a bias edge. So I don't want to spend a lot of time stretching it, kind of working my 2 straight of grain edges to get it even, but I'm not putting a lot of pressure or stretch on that particular long edge. And we're going to line up again with our cutting grid and our cutting mat, making sure we're up here at the tip. And we're going to cut. Now we've got our 4 triangles. So we started out with our square. We've cut on both diagonals, and that yields us our 4 triangles. Now, we had one side with bias edge exposed. Guess what? Now we've got 2. Handle these babies with care. We don't want to get that stretched out. We're going to be using those as setting triangles later on. We want that outer edge of our quilt to lie flat. So normally when I make this cut, I then just go ahead and stack these together, realizing I am not going to be using them in the piecing until later. Just do a nice stack. I've got my label. I just use scraps of paper and write on it the particular label and stick a pin in it. That way I don't have to think later, you know, what particular piece is this? Why is it cut? And then set it aside and they're ready to go. As I take a quick glance down through the rest of the cutting instructions, everything is really pretty straightforward. You should be comfortable cutting those strips and then subcutting into rectangles. So now we're going to get ready to start making our blocks. And that's when it gets fun. We're getting to see things coming together. Now, our next step in making this quilt, after we've got everything cut, labeled, set aside as we need to, we are ready to start piecing our blocks. So we are starting out with our A and B rectangles, and I'm going to go ahead and pull those out of the bags that I had them pre-cut and labeled into. And I'll take off my top 4 here. And what we're doing is just making a strip set. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We are just sewing these together to make an AB unit. And this can be done real easily with just chain piecing. Picking up 1A, 1B, folding them together, right sides together. and stitching. And I'm using a 1/4 inch foot with a blade attachment. That way it helps me keep a really nice even seam allowance. And this is a particular project where chain piecing would be very time effective. So what you can do is just go ahead, grab your next 4, and even if you want to just keep stack of all your A's, keep your 4 like fabric pieces together, and then just pick up the next one and keep running them through the sewing machine until you get all of them stitched. Really fast, time effective way to handle your stitching by doing the chain piecing. Then you can take all of them to the ironing board at one time and go ahead and press them then. After we've got all of our A and B pieces stitched together, I'm going to just snip them apart real quick, and we are going to want to press those. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead and press them to the darker side, or to the caramel colored side. Because I'm using a variety of different colors, I just want to be consistent here. I know my caramel isn't going to allow anything to shadow through underneath it, so I'm going to press that direction. Now what we're going to do is take our 4 units, and the arrangement is the key part here. So we've got a diagram in your instructions that shows how to arrange them. And basically what we're ending up with is kind of a plus sign right in the middle. There we go. So we've got them rotated so that all of our A's are in the center. And again, if you wanted to, go ahead and just lay out stacks of these, layer of 4, and then we could just chain piece everything together. But I'm going to work with just the individual block here. And we're going to stitch that together. And at this stage, pressing these seams again so they're nest. Just going to do a quick finger press and take this seam allowance this way underneath the A square, and press my seam allowance on the other row the opposite direction, so that when we get ready to stitch here, we have those so they nest together. And this is a personal preference. I'm not a pinner. If you've taken any of my classes, you'll hear that all the time. If you want to go ahead and stick a pin right here for this intersection to hold it, if that's what you're comfortable with doing, by all means, do what is most comfortable for you and get you the results that you want. So you can hold that together with a pin. I tend to just push them together with my fingers, and you can feel it nest together as those seam allowances come together. So now we have our completed block. Got another one finished here. And that's it to making the block. Just a real simple block. Kind of gives us the look of a plus sign there in the middle. Very easy. I chain piece it, and just a beautiful way to make blocks. Now, this part of the quilt was really pretty simple and straightforward. We're going to spend a little bit more time as we get into this assembly diagram and laying out the block, putting it together, adding the sashing strips, adding the setting triangles, working with our corner units. That's where it gets a little bit more complex. I know you can handle it, but we're going to talk through it a little bit and we'll get ready to do that next. Hopefully at this stage you've got all of your blocks made, and now we're ready to go ahead and start laying them out. And in this case we're working on the completing the quilt section of our pattern, and it refers us to the assembly diagram. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a little bit more complex assembly diagram than straightforward blocks in rows and stitching rows together or rows on a diagonal. We've got diagonal rows, we've got partial sashings, we've got setting squares, pieced setting triangles, all sorts of good stuff happening with this one. I'm going to pull out the assembly diagram here real quick and just talk a little bit about it. What I have done is, from what's in your download, I went ahead and enlarged it just to make it a little bit easier for us to work with. Each of us have a different learning style. Some of us are very good at reading directions, text, and then following those directions and doing something. Others of us, myself included, are just give me the picture and I will take it from there. So in this case, the assembly diagram is that picture. And the pattern is written with both, where we've got text instructions and then we also have the assembly diagram. So what we're working on is putting blocks along with sashings together into diagonal rows, and wherever there is a space in between, then that segment gets sewed together first before we do another step. And this is what's called exploding the assembly diagram, so you can see which sections need to be sewed together. So we're going to start out with just sewing the blocks together because that's the easiest part. And each of the blocks are going to have a sashing strip in between them. And this is where that labeling all of your strips when you're cutting them out comes in very handy. Because I have all of my eye strips here already cut and labeled as eye strips. And we're going to sew an eye strip in between each one of the blocks. And the block orientation doesn't matter. It's the same whichever way we turn it. But we're going to sew those together. And what we'll end up with is this segment of 3 blocks with 2 eye strips pieced between them. And I'm not actually going to demonstrate any of the sewing for you at this stage. If you've made the blocks, the sewing is just the same. 1/4 inch seam and then press. It's just this concept of working through how all this goes together. We now have this section together. We'll need our J strip. And in the assembly diagram, to help you everybody follow along, where I am at is right here. In this particular area. So we have our 3 blocks, 1, 2, 3, 2 eye strips right there. All of this pieced together as one strip. We're now going to position our J strip right here and sew it in place. And this is our J strip right here. So that will be joined together. And now we have our setting triangles, which are the M pieces. Those were those big triangles that we cut earlier where we had that big square and we wrapped it both directions. I now have my M triangles right here. And we will piece those in place. Orientation is the key here. We want to make sure that we've got that triangle going in the correct direction. So following along right here, we want to make sure we have that triangle oriented the proper way, and we have this triangle at the other end oriented the proper way. Otherwise, if we would happen to piece this way, when we get ready to put our quilt together, we're going to have it not lying in the correct direction, and we'll have something flopping over the edge. So we want to make sure that we have those setting triangles going in the proper direction. If you have a design wall at your disposal when you're laying out a quilt like this, I highly, highly, highly recommend using it. Just pin up all the parts and then take them down as you need them, so that way you don't get anything confused. If not, a big table, laying it out on a bed, assuming that you don't have any pets that are going to be assisting you, you can lay it out on the floor. Pets always like to change the layout on us, especially when we turn our back. If not, and you're just working in a small area like this, where you've got just a tabletop, your work surface to work on, then just methodically go through each individual step and make sure you label it. But this would be our layout for the section right here, and we're going to sew that together. This actually matches what is right here on the opposite side of the quilt. So we're going to be making 2 of those. Right here and right here are matching. And if you've got the orientation correct on your M triangles, this rotated around will match that they're mirror images of each other. So that takes care of this particular strip and how we would lay it out to piece it. Now let's move off to this corner unit here, and let's do a quick layout so you understand how that goes together. The 2 M triangles, and now we need an N triangle. And I've got one of those right here. And this would be our placement that is going to match this unit right here. And thinking back to when we were cutting, we've got bias edge, bias edge, bias edge. But the one thing you're going to note on the outside edges of this quilt, going right here where we're getting ready to put our border on, those were all cut on the straight of grain. This is straight of grain because we've got our bias in here, our bias in here, bias here, here, and here, straight, straight, and straight. So when we're working with those bias edges, we're actually containing them within this stitched unit. And that's a really important thing when you're putting those long borders on, that we don't have to worry about this outer edge stretching or this edge here stretching. It's contained. All that bias we're going to get stitched in here. So now we're ready to assemble this particular section, and we will just sew ice strip onto block, and then we're going to bring our 2 M triangles onto the sides, sew them in place, press after each seam. This is where pressing is critical, and then our last seam will be attaching that N triangle. That makes this particular corner unit right here. This really isn't too difficult, is it? Now that we're kind of breaking this down into segments Just rearranging the pieces, we've got them all. So don't be intimidated by these assembly diagrams. They're actually your friend. We just have to kind of break them out and handle them each individually. This strip right here, we will have treated exactly the same as the 3-block strip. This one just happens to be 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Putting the longer strip on one side, adding the 2 rectangles on both sides. And on each of these, we're going to be making 2 sets so that we have one here, here, and here. Exact same here, here, and here. That then leaves us with this big middle section. That middle section is not nearly as intimidating as what it looks. 6 blocks pieced together with 5 eye strips in between them, right here and right here. And then a long strip in between so that we're getting that together in one big block. And then we're going to be piecing this setting triangle. Not much different than piecing this one, but let me go ahead and take you through those steps. We'll lay it out and then I'll let you see what it looks like stitched together. I've got my finished one right here. So let me get them in the same orientation as our assembly diagram, where we've got our block going this way, our end strip, or excuse me, end triangle at the top, eye strip here, and M right here. So that is going to pair up exactly the same as these 4 pieces. Sewing our eye to our block, coming in with our M triangle right here, and then adding our end triangle at the end. And when all that is pieced and sewed together, we will have this particular unit right here, all stitched together. And that is going to be, when we rotate it, exactly the same as the unit down here at the bottom. So we've got this one at the top, and we will flip him around, and that is going to make the opposite corner of the quilt. Easy. It really is. At first looking at this, you kind of want to be like, hoo-hoo, I can't do that. Yes, you can. Breaking it down step by step. I went ahead and worked through it visually off the assembly diagram. That's how my brain works. Hey, I can't help it. It's me. For those of you who process things better by reading directions, we've got all of this written out here through all of these steps, where it talks you through text-wise what to sew together. And then it allows you to reference back to this just to confirm your orientations. Now, we've got this part done. We're just going to sew all of these rows that we have created, the big rows that include the setting triangles and the sashing strips. We're going to sew all that together to make our quilt center, the piece center of our quilt top. Then we just need to add our borders on to finish out the top of our quilt. So now we're going to change gears and go over to the borders. And the borders is where it gets fun. We're just doing these cute little piece borders here. And we've got D and C. D is the caramel colored squares. They're all 2.5-inch squares. And C's are the ones that we cut out of our 5-inch squares. And I just want a nice scrappy appearance. I just put 2 pinks side by side. Let me scoot that one over. Go with another caramel one. The short row is, we need 7 of each. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Lay those out. Just stitch them together real quick. What we end up with is a pieced segment that looks like this. And I'll just clear these guys up so that way it's easy for you to see that we stitched those out. This makes the piece section of our border row, and we're going to need 2 of those for each of the borders. We are then going to sew another piece onto there. And that is our F strip. And then we will, that is our E strip, and then we are going to sew this larger F strip onto the end. So again, very straightforward piecing. You guys can handle this. I have complete confidence in you. And that is making this side border row right here. You'll see it if we orient it this way with our little piece squares, our additional sashing strip, and then our longer piece. And we're going to make 2 of those. The most important thing about the pieced borders is making sure you've got your orientation correct, that we've got the piece strip sewn on the correct side of the non-piece strip. Otherwise, you'll end up with a border that might be flipped around. It isn't going to line up properly. And then when we do the same thing and make our top and bottom borders in the exact same fashion, but here we're sewing this on a different direction. You'll notice that the strip is on the opposite side of the pieced strip and that this is on an opposite end as that. So that way we get this asymmetrical look here at the top and the bottom. That pretty much takes us through how to make the Charm Plus quilt. Really pretty straightforward, pretty simple once we get through and we kind of take a look at it. Once you get done with your quilt top, hopefully I shared with you some of the logic and the thought process behind why we did some of the things that we do as the pattern instructs. You know, why do we cut the setting triangles a certain way with all that bias edge? Well, that gives us nice straight of grain to work with when we're getting ready to sew these borders on. So really straightforward, some easy piecing, lots of straight lines. And now the fun is up to you. You get to layer it, quilt it, and bind it. And in your packet is a quilting basics that's going to give you some steps on doing that, particularly on getting your binding stitched together. And have fun with this one. Pick out some really pretty fabrics. When Bev designed the quilt, she went with some brown tones, particularly in some cream, a very neutral, kind of a little bit more of a modern look. I twisted it up and went with the Batiks on it and used my bright punches in with my Batiks, but then used a kind of a really rich, warm caramel for my background. Have fun with this quilt. Pick out some really cute 5-inch pre-cut squares. We've talked to you about how to select those, making sure that you're getting 2 of each, and you'll be ready to rock and roll and make some Charm Plus quilts. If you want to learn more about working with them and some more projects, I want to share with you my time-saving quilting with Precuts online class or DVD. Either format is available. This particular quilt, my Charming Gold and Gray quilt, was made completely with 5-inch Precuts, and then also some coordinating tonal fabric here. And the quilt that has been behind me for this entire class is another pattern that I designed for Annie's, and it's made with 5-inch squares. And instead of cutting them into rectangles like we did with Charms Plus, with it we're using them trimmed down just a little bit, but as squares, and then also pieced together for our triangles. So another option than just with a solid paired with that. But another option for you if you have been smitten by this little pre-cut bug. It is a fun little bug to be smitten by. They are so darn cute and so adorable, but I wanted to share with you real quick just a couple other resources in case you are interested in learning more and getting more patterns to work with pre-cuts. Have fun, and I hope to see you again in another one of our Annie's Creative Studio classes.